Good morning. Good morning. A very special good morning to all viewing on the social media and who are also listening away from the viewing aspect. Let me warmly welcome you to this morning's press conference at the Leader of the Opposition's office on today, the Sunday, May the 7th, 2023, from Charles Street in Port of Spain. This morning, I have my colleague, Senator Sen Lyder, with me. And Senator Lyder, amongst his other duties, shadows trade. And so this morning, he will be speaking on matters related to trade. I am supposed to be speaking on some health issues, but steering before us today on the front line of the newspapers, all three daily newspapers, the weekend newspapers, the Sunday Express, Brent on his own, the Sunday Guardian, error in judgment, government appeals decision in Brent Thomas's matter, since judge is wrong, the state is appealing. And on Newsday, state lodges appeal in Brent Thomas case, elite unit linked to abduction. So all three weekend newspapers and daily newspapers have at their front pages matters related to the and discussions on the Brent Thomas case. Now, we as an opposition and an alternate government, very responsible. We are aware that this matter is before the courts. But suffice it to say, the opposition as the alternate government, we have spoken on this matter, and we have made strong statements on this, questioning whether there is an absence of the rule of law, questioning whether there is the presence of units within the police service beholding to the executive and takes instructions from the executive. And I call upon the Prime Minister this morning to state whether there is any transnational security outfit of which Trinidad and Tobago is a part, of which is involved in the kidnapping of its citizens. I ask, is there a rogue element, almost Gestapo in nature, which functions outside of the ambit of the police force and police service? And whether that unit reports directly to the Prime Minister and Minister of National Security. We are limited in what we can say in precise details. Tomorrow, my colleagues will speak a little more on this matter at the Monday meeting. But suffice it to say now that the state's management of this, it stinks to the highest heavens. It has the effect of seriously compromising our international reputation. And my colleague, Senator Mark, spoke about this previously, about our status in relation to how we are perceived internationally. And seriously compromising what many may say is an unstable democracy, where due process of the rule of law supposed to be of paramount importance, but where it is perceived not to be, and where our constitutional rights are perceived as to be taken away from citizens. So, amidst all of these questions to be answered, the Prime Minister must take ownership of this fiasco and seek to immediately rectify this matter instead of running away from Trinidad and Tobago at such a critical state in our country's management on what many people will say is a personal pleasure trip, where the country is burning and falling apart, as it seems, from crime, mismanagement, incompetence, corruption. Hundreds of thousands of citizens are unemployed. People cannot eat properly. They cannot send their children to school. And there's overall destruction of the society. So this morning, we call upon the Prime Minister, if he cannot handle his duties, which he's supposed to be here to be managing this aspect, a very important issue that has surfaced in the country, he should do the honorable thing and call a general election, which our citizens generally across the country are calling for urgently. And we ask the question, is this the beginning of a police state? So this is as far as I will go in relation to the Brent Thomas matter. There's another issue which I came across today, and that is a matter of, in one of the newspapers, I think it is the Guardian, which speaks of the legal fees, hefty legal fees. The Guardian, state pays over $1 billion to attorneys between 2015 to 2023. I believe it has come up to about more than $1 billion. And I want to remind citizens that when the UNC government, when the elections and another party came in, the PNM came in 2015, they began to make some serious accusations about the amount of money that we spent on legal fees. And here it is now, it has come back to haunt the PNM, where, based on the freedom of information by the political activist Rabi Margovind Maharaj, it said the state pays over $1 billion to attorneys between 2015 to 2023. And this is now taking on the visage of a cartel in the legal fraternity. It began in the 2002 to 2010 PNM administration under Prime Minister Manning then, with the same names being prominent receivers of millions of dollars. And it is continuing today under the PNM regime with impunity. And it involves, as before, highly questionable political persecution that falter in the courts and end up costing taxpayers millions of dollars, going to, in summary, billions of dollars. You have the Nelson case with $20 to $30 million involved, and now this Brent Thomas matter, which is now going to be appealed and going to be obviously before the appeal court, before the Privy Council, will cost another tidy sum of millions of dollars again. So this involves, as before, all these matters, highly questionable political persecution that falter in the courts and end up costing taxpayers even more and more millions, amounting to greater than 1 billion. It is an abuse of process. It is blatant nepotism and possibly violates our integrity in public life laws, along with other laws regulating conflict of interest. The United National Congress will say much more on this matter tomorrow at tomorrow's meeting, but for now, this warrants an immediate probe by an independent authority. It must be stopped because it is robbing taxpayers of their money, which can be used to develop our country's infrastructure, provide food on the table for people, send their children to school, create employment, and provide critical services in health and education, etc. The Prime Minister must use his authority to stop this travesty and abuse, to stop this legal cartel that is running out of the Attorney General's office and cabinet immediately. And that must be done to protect taxpayers' interests and our country's treasury. I note that in the payments, there is a $14 million payment to the husband of the Excellency, the President. Now, with greatest respect, I asked the question this morning whether the husband of Her Excellency the President will avail himself of receiving briefs and legal briefs where state funds will obviously have to be paid to him while he is a member in the President's household. Is there going to be a conflict of interest? Is there going to be a travesty in terms of declarations of interest and integrity commissions and so on? So we would await some statements from the Honorable Attorney on this matter. Next, there is a question emanating from payments of about 20 million to the law firm of Sequel Law. And obviously, everyone knows the Sequel Law is the chambers of the present Attorney General. And it is incumbent upon the Attorney General to come clean on the matter related to his payments of close to $20 million on work that he has done for the state, when he has done it, when was he paid. And recently, Sequel Law represented the state in a matter in Miami. And how much was he paid for that when the court in Miami found that he was not speaking the truth? So there are many questions to be answered in this. It will be interesting to hear what the Law Association has to say on this matter of this amount of funding going to being paid to attorneys of almost over $1 billion in briefs. And this does not include as well approximately $35 million to an English law firm which has been in Trinidad from nearly 8 years now, who have been paid $40 million already, and who are not being, I think $35 million is allocated for payment to that English law firm for just going behind to determine if they can find anything on any UNC member of parliament or previous UNC minister. And that 75, 80 million is not accounted for in this $1.1 billion payment. In addition, it had not mentioned the fees paid in 2016 to two auditing firms of PricewaterhouseCoopers and Ernst & Young of close to about 30 million, I seem to recall, for doing analysis and investigations into the UNC between 2010 and 2015. So a significant amount of this money of $1.1 billion plus and counting has been paid to attorneys who the state has employed to go after UNC former ministers and present members of parliament. It's unpardonable. It stinks to the high heavens what this government is about and what Prime Minister Rowley and the government has been doing over the last 7.5 years. So these two matters I close for the time being, and my colleagues tomorrow will speak a little more on those matters. On Friday the 5th of May, Reuters, CNN, and WHO, Washington Post, New York Times, and our local newspapers on the Saturday Express of the after 3 years, WHO declares COVID no longer a global emergency. And then you had the Guardian, Newsday, WHO, COVID pandemic over, Saturday, May the 6th, page 5. And then Newsday, WHO, COVID-19 pandemic is over. So all three daily newspapers carried articles in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. So on Friday, the 5th of May, WHO President Dr. Tedros, he has the surname is very long, that the Emergency Scientific Committee advised him at the 15th meeting since the COVID pandemic that COVID-19 or COVID-19 is no longer a public health emergency, and so he declared that on Friday, the 5th of May. He took their advice. The public health emergency of international concern was declared on January 30th, 2020, more than 3 years ago, on the advice of an emergency committee convened under the international health regulations of WHO. That was the same day, on January 30th, that the opposition, led by Mrs. Kamla Persad-Bissessar, I raised a matter of urgent public importance on the COVID-19 for us to have a debate and discussions on it. It was refused. It was refused on 2 subsequent occasions in the lower house. That's 3 in the lower house and twice in the Senate. So 5 times the matter for debate on COVID was refused. Needless to say, the WHO announced on May 11th that the COVID-19 was a pandemic. And so Trinidad and Tobago, following the WHO guidelines, Under the Public Health Ordinance, Chapter 12, Number 4, regulations were made by the Minister of Health under Section 105 and confirmed by the President under Section 167 of the Public Health Ordinance. Trinidad and Tobago, as the Chief Medical Officer and the Minister of Health had been saying, they modeled their 2019 novel coronavirus regulations from WHO. Now that WHO 2 days ago has declared that COVID-19 is no longer a global health emergency of international concern, Trinidad and Tobago government and the Minister of Health must also do so urgently. And let me refer in particular to Regulation by Order 28 of March 2023, just a few days ago, and to be effected from the 31st of March. It was enacted and effected, and today is May the 6th. No, sorry, May the 7th. So effected 7 days ago. And Regulations 3 and 4 under the Public Health 2019 Novel Coronavirus Regulations of 2023, it speaks about failure to wear masks and carrying fixed penalty under Schedule 2 of thousands of dollars and or 3 days in jail. And it speaks about failure to wear a mask in a public or private hospital, public clinic, or private medical clinic. Also the failure of a child. So the United Nations Congress I call for this administration and Minister Dayal Singh to follow the WHO announcement, do the same, and remove all these emergency regulations immediately. So we cannot continue to have people being fined and threatened to be in jail when WHO has recommended that COVID is no longer a public health emergency, and therefore the regulations governing that should not be affected so as to bring about the possibility of fines and people ending up in jail. Now, the wearing of masks should not be mandatory anymore in any place. But as a responsible alternate government, we advise citizens to take particular care in terms of their health management, particularly those who have chronic non-communicable diseases of diabetes and hypertension and cancer, and of course, who are immunocompromised, and particularly senior citizens who stand the risk of possibly still dying if they, but unfortunately, catch the COVID virus. So there should be continued responsibility in terms of protection of one's own health, particularly the senior citizens. But there should be no regulations which mandate citizens now to wear masks and face the penalties of fines or being in jail. And I think it's critically important for me to just remind the population of what has occurred over the last 3 years. And I think now that this COVID issue is being closed, we must never forget what transpired over the last 3 years related to this COVID. We know internationally billions of vaccines were given. Almost 760 million global citizens were affected, and close to 7 million citizens died. the country with the largest amount of deaths being the United States. 1 million citizens died. Some observers and scientists believe close to 20 million global citizens died. And here in Trinidad and Tobago, unfortunately, 4,400 citizens died. Trinidad and Tobago being one of the countries in the world with the highest amount of deaths per million population, unfortunately. And I have always said that it is because of mismanagement of the entire COVID situation in Trinidad and Tobago. And hundreds of lives could have been saved if there were proper management by this Rowley's administration and the Minister of Health. So when COVID-19 became a pandemic in March 2020, this Dr. Rowley's government was totally unprepared to manage the surge in infection and deaths. There was insufficient testing, insufficient kits, deliberate under-testing to hoodwink the population to steal the election of 2020. They fooled the population in 2020, giving them the thinking that they were very competent and able to manage this COVID-19 infection. And they basically hoodwinked the population and stole the election in 2020. There was insufficient personal protective equipment. The whole country knew that for the nursing, medical, and paraprofessional staff. No gloves, not enough gloves, gowns, masks. There were insufficient doctors at the front line. Even junior doctors were not of the amount that is required. Nurses, paraprofessionals, and of course consultant doctors to look after the patients in the ICUs and the HDUs. Nursing and medical staff were tired and overworked. There were insufficient oxygen and emergency tents in the hospitals where patients were dying for lack of oxygen. Insufficient ventilators where citizens over 70 years of age were unable to get ventilators. When we asked the question about the amount of deaths in ICU, they refused to answer, but the Simongal report showed that there was a 99% of patients who went to ICU died. In fact, the ICU was considered when you go in there, you come out dead, unfortunately. And families of patients who went to the ICU knew nothing about their families who were in there. And some of them, even a number of days after, were then informed of the passing of their relative. Very painful. Some families lost 2 to 3 members of their families. There were some children are now homeless. Police officers died, nurses died, and so on. So people were dying in ambulances. They were dying on the way to the emergency tents. Patients were in emergency tents for 6 to 7 days without a report of whether they're COVID positive or negative. They're dying in emergency tents. They're dying in emergency departments of the general hospitals of Mount Hope and so on. And all because of incompetence and mismanagement of Minister Diyal Singh and his team at that time. At one time, there were about 10,000 COVID-infected patients at home, but no medical help for them and no drugs. The drugs, there were shortages of things like the important life-saving drugs of dexamethasone, anticoagulants, remdesivir, the monoclonal antibodies of tocilizumab, the basic antibiotics of azithromycin. So, we, having seen that, the leader of the opposition, Mrs. Kamla Prasad Bisesa, and myself began to call for an investigation into this whole matter. The country must never forget this. Although now this COVID issue now is being closed by WHO, we have to remember what occurred over those 3 years. And we asked for an investigation to be done. We called for a commission of inquiry, but Dr. Rowley evaded that, and he appointed a 5-member team to analyze it, gave them 3 weeks. When they said they couldn't do the work in 3 weeks, they gave them three months. And a lot of things were kept away from that commission, from that team, the Simongal team, with very competent professionals. And they made a statement when they asked for notes, only 20 notes were given out of the thousands of patients who were in the hospitals. They indicated there was 19 recommendations were made. Now, 1 year and 2 months later, none of these recommendations have been implemented. What a disastrous government that we have. Significant aspects of chronic non-communicable diseases, which the Simongal report asked for. Nothing has been done about it. So, Trinidad and Tobago continues to be in a health crisis. At another opportune time that I will speak much more about it. It's a deliberate government policy of underemployment. The local doctors and nurses and paraprofessionals are not being employed in the public health sector, seriously compromising the lives of our citizens. There are hundreds of vacancies in these health institutions, over 1,000 nursing vacancies, more than 300 vacancies for doctors. 7 years of promise of a new central block, a general hospital, and only the steel structure is going up after 7.5 years. If you look at the emergency departments of General Hospital Port of Spain now, you will see at least 50 citizens on trolleys, don't know where they are. It's like a crowded market of very sick citizens who are dying in the emergency departments. I want people to have a look at what is happening right there in Port of Spain Hospital in the emergency departments. And emergency departments in all hospitals as well. Patients are there's overcrowding. Patients are on their trolleys, they are on their wheelchairs for 24 to 48 hours and they can't even get a bed. So while they have spent close to about $40 billion so far on the health sector within the 7 years, and where have that money gone? What have they done with the money? And so it's total mismanagement and incompetence. They closed down the primary healthcare centers, which we had opened up to 9 p.m. on evenings and on weekends and public holidays. All of those have been brought back down to 4 p.m. Some have been closed, whereas the basic tenets of hypertension and diabetes could have been managed there with citizens going after 4 o'clock, coming from work and so on. They said that they would not open Cougar Hospital because they did not have enough doctors. A lie, because there were hundreds of doctors waiting for jobs. Then they said they're waiting for a report. And the report came 2 years after. And after that, they did nothing about the report. They gave 50%, 51% of the Cougar Hospital shares to the UWI, saying that UWI will begin to manage the area. The report said that they should get external body to help them manage the Cougar Hospital. Nothing had been forthcoming. So 7.5 years later, Cougar Hospital is laid to waste with no ability and nothing in sight for utilizing all the machinery and equipment at Cougar Hospital for the benefit of citizens and of Trinidad and Tobago. So patients are waiting 2 years for clinic appointment, months and years for surgery. They don't have the drugs to give to cancer treatment. The CDAP drugs are ineffective. So it's a whole quagmire of medical incompetence and negligence being perpetrated by Minister Diyal Singh and his team. So we call upon the Prime Minister and the Minister of Health to begin to work in a constructive manner and do what is required of you to save the lives of citizens, innocent citizens in Trinidad and Tobago. In fact, when you go into one of these major hospitals, you have to pray, and families pray almost every day and every night for their members of their families to come out alive. Very few come out alive when they go in with critical matters, where with dedication and support, they could have been saved. So the health sector is in a terrible crisis. We need expertise, we need committed management principles and practices. We need the government to do what is required to provide the quality health care, which is a constitutional right of our citizens. So, in summary, ladies and gentlemen, we call for the cessation of regulations related to the COVID-19 pandemic, and we urge the Minister of Health and his team to begin to work. After 7.5 years you have been there, Minister. It is time enough that this country sees some light at the end of the tunnel in terms of their families being taken care of at these public institutions. We have 10 hospitals. We have 9 district health facilities which are supposed to be open 24 hours a day. We have 105 health centers. We have thousands of workers in the health sector, but yet still we cannot manage that. I want to say, give us a chance again. We did tremendous amount of work this morning. It's not a time for me to be making any statements as to the performance of our 5 years under Mrs. Kamla Prasad Bisesa in the health sector, Minister Khan and his team and the UNC team, what we performed. But it is time enough that the citizens become aware of the negligence and the mismanagement and the incompetence of what is pervasive now in almost every sector of society, including the health sector, and give us a chance once more to be able to govern and to be able to bring solace and bring great health care, and in all areas of governance to begin to bring this country back to the state that it was between 2010 and 2015. Thank you very much for this time to speak with you, ladies and gentlemen. And I now hand you over to Senator Sen Lyder, who will speak on matters related to trade.
Thank you, Dr. Tim Goopeesing. And of course, Dr. Goopeesing, thank you for that very comprehensive presentation on what was a plethora of issues that you have gone through in a very short space of time. It is indeed an honor to share this press conference with you this morning. And I want to say good morning as well to the media and to those listening in. And sitting here listening to Dr. Goopeesing this morning, it has become apparent that week after week, there are more and more startling and stunning revelations coming out from the sheer incompetence, mismanagement, and lack of care from this PNM government administration. Dr. Goopeesing has stated issues happening in the healthcare system, the Attorney General's office. We continue to see this government mismanage, this government trample on the rights and freedoms of our system, and continue to decimate our economy. Week after week, we come with these issues, and last week was no different, especially as it pertains to the economy as well as the private sector in this country. Again, we had to see in the Senate earlier this week a startling revelation coming from the Minister of Finance, the now acting Prime Minister, I believe he still is, while the Prime Minister is frolicking on a trip in Barbados.
18-hole golf course.
18-hole golf course. Shrimp, I think shrimp and caviar, while Rome burns, and in this case, while the citizens of Trinidad and Tobago continue to suffer. Just this week in the Senate, there was this revelation by the government that there's a whopping $7.8 billion owing in VAT refunds to the private sector in this country. And this practice of piling up these amounts owed to hardworking, productive businesses in our country is now symbolic of this government's lack of concern for the private sector. The willingness to leave these VAT refunds without honoring their legal requirements to pay businesses is nothing short of abuse to the private sector by this government. And I took the opportunity to look into the legal requirements so that I can show the citizens of this country, and specifically the private sector, the level of abuse being meted out to manufacturers in this country, to the energy sector in this country, and to other businesses in this nation. And one only has to look at the Value Added Tax Act, Chapter 7506 of the laws of Trinidad and Tobago, to get an understanding as to the penalties that each party would be liable to. Should the private sector pay VAT late, or should the government pay VAT refunds late back to the private sector? And if we look at Section 54(1), it clearly states, where any amount that a person is required to pay to the board, and in this case, VAT to the board, is not paid by the due date, the amount outstanding bears a penalty of 8% of the amount outstanding and the interest rate of 2% per month or part of a month. Now that is if you, the businessman, pays your VAT late. That is what you're liable to pay. And believe me, the government is going to collect their money. But if we look further in Section 35(3), this is regarding now VAT refunds to businesses onto the private sector. So Section 35(3) of the Value Added Tax Act, it states, any amount of refund due to that remains outstanding for more than a period of 6 months after A, the day by which the return in which the refund was specified as being due was required to be furnished to the board, or B, the date on which the return referred to in paragraph A was furnished to the board, whichever is the latter, shall bear interest at the rate of 1% per month or part of a month from the day after the expiration of that period until the amount outstanding is satisfied in accordance with Section 2 or in accordance with the laws of the land. Now, every businessman knows that you have a penalty to pay. But I asked the Minister of Finance today, has the government been paying this 1% due to these businesses, which is required by law? Because as we know, at $7.8 billion outstanding in VAT refunds, we know that many of these businesses have been waiting for well more than 6 months, some for a year, some for 2 years to get their VAT refunds. It was the very respectable and respected businessman Arthur Lockjack who was on record in a newspaper article indicating that his company is being owed tens of millions of dollars in VAT refunds. And this is impacting the liquidity of his company. Ladies and gentlemen, it is not the opposition alone. In fact, in today's Sunday Express, right here, where we see the Trinidad and Tobago Chamber of Commerce chime in on this issue of delinquent VAT refunds from the government. Here is what they stated, and I will quote it, the article. In all the discussions about payments of the long overdue refunds, there have been no details on how the interest due on these cash refunds will be addressed, the Chamber stated, adding that it looked forward to Imbert's mid-year review on the matter. So, Minister Imbert, you have not only been asked by the opposition to furnish us with this information, but the Trinidad and Tobago Chamber of Commerce is calling on you to deal with the matter of the 1% interest rate due to many of those companies who've had to endure higher cost of production, having to borrow, in many cases, borrow funds to be able to continue operating while you hold on to these companies' money. Your ministry, that is. Ladies and gentlemen, the Minister of Finance's decision to lay blame at the feet of businesses who do not pay VAT on time was a fanciful way of passing the buck. The government cannot and must not sidestep their duty to pay VAT refunds on a timely basis to businesses. Many of these manufacturers, these companies that are claiming their VAT refunds, they are paying their VAT upfront to the government. They're not delinquent. They're paying the VAT upfront to the government, and they demand their refunds. Delinquent VAT payers have nothing to do with manufacturers who have paid this VAT money in advance to the ports when they're importing their raw materials. And when they're exporting the finished product, not able to charge VAT to the international community or to international customers, have a right by law to claim this VAT back. So they have paid this money in advance. So this is not an issue of delinquent payers of VAT. This is an accounting issue by the government of Trinidad and Tobago, by the Ministry of Finance led by the Honorable Colm Imbert. Because you are taking this money, receiving this money at the port. It's going into the consolidated fund, Dr. Goopeesing. And if it is that the minister is using this to buy ferries that don't work, Coast Guard vessels that sit in Stobles Bay, not being used to protect our borders, or in paving highways in the middle of a forest, and are not properly managing these VAT funds that have been paid in advance, you cannot come now. It is disingenuous for the minister to come now to blame delinquent VAT payers. That's a different issue. And of course, we support any measure that will deal with collecting delinquent VAT. But you must pay the VAT refunds back to manufacturers in this country. The government is literally keeping these funds almost as an interest-free loan from manufacturers in this country. And by keeping more than $7.8 billion out of the private sector, they have withheld much needed liquidity to these manufacturers. Desperately need this liquidity. This capital is needed to support operations and for expansion. How can manufacturers expect to fulfill the TTMA's mandate of doubling manufacturing by 2025, which is, Dr. Goopeesing, in a year and a half from now? How do manufacturers expect to fulfill this mandate of doubling if they are being punished by this government for trying to increase exports? If they increase exports, more VAT is being held. So they're literally being punished. I think it is also Arthur Lockjack that indicated that they literally feel that they're being punished for expanding. Ladies and gentlemen, and this again shows that the government is again being disingenuous and is indeed not supporting the TTMA's thrust and manufacturers' trust to double export. And ladies and gentlemen, I was in the Senate when this was announced, and the People's National Movement senators on that side, they were literally thumping their desks when the Minister of Finance announced that this $3 billion VAT bond and an additional $1 or $2 billion, he never stated exactly how much. We don't know if it's one, we don't know if it's two, but if we are to hold the minister by his word for the last almost 8 years, I suspect it's between 0 and 1 billion, but I cast no aspersions. Let's wait and see what happens. But when this was announced of the 3 billion VAT bonds, on the between 1 or 2 billion dollars in cash being paid, this is not a favor to the manufacturers. So there's no reason for the PNM to have been thumping any desks as though there was some great feat or accomplishment made by that PNM government. These VAT monies belong to manufacturers. It is not the property of the government. It is not money belonging to the government. And you know what they say? When you take something that is not yours, you know what they call you. I will not say it here. But there's a word used for those who take things that don't belong to them. So the government must not ban desks because of fulfilling an obligation that is mandated by law. The government must understand that by their actions, they are systematically removing liquidity from the system, hurting manufacturers and their capability to expand, and ultimately they are punishing manufacturers who are engaging in export by not paying back this VAT. And I have said that several times. The VAT bond offers, whereas that is welcomed by the Trinidad and Tobago Chamber of Commerce, it is clear that it's not a sustainable solution to this problem. This will again, of course, add to the debt profile of the country. And therefore, when the government wants to come at the end of fiscal year 2022 and boasts of a fiscal surplus, yet they are owing $7.8 billion to manufacturers in this country. I put it to you that if they had done what they were supposed to do and paid this VAT back, the Honorable Colin Mimbert would have had to declare a deficit.
A larger deficit.
A much larger deficit than a $1.08 billion surplus.
At least about $8 billion deficit.
And I want to make it clear that this is again not the opposition saying this. I go back to the same article in the Express newspaper today from the Trinidad and Tobago Chamber of Commerce, and I want to read what they've stated in this article, and I quote, "It is important to note that this bond issue, together with the proposed cash payment, does not settle the full value of the $7.8 billion owed to the business community." We know that would leave around $2.8 billion as at the end of March 2023. We know there's 6 more months to go for the balance of this financial year, Dr. Goopeesing. How many more billions will be added between March and September?
Which will not be paid.
Which will not be paid. There's no provision made for it. But this is the Chamber of Commerce stating that it will not settle the full value of the $7.8 billion. At best, if the government sticks to its promise of $2 billion and the $3 billion VAT refunds, it will leave $7.8 billion plus whatever is accumulated in the next 6 months. The Trinidad and Tobago Chamber recalled that it has repeatedly called for the matter of the long outstanding VAT refunds to be settled. And listen to this: clarification on how the balance of arrears will be paid and over what period is urgently required. This is the Trinidad and Tobago Chamber of Commerce. The opposition has repeatedly called on this minister to come clean about these details. But again, Dr. Goopeesing, I don't want to just leave it to the Trinidad and Tobago Chamber of Commerce or the opposition. Let me for a brief moment take you through what happened in the Senate this Tuesday gone. You see, this revelation of $7.8 billion came as a result of a question posed to the Honorable Minister of Finance by independent Senator Amrita Dinarine, not the opposition. The minister skirts around the opposition, but he was smoked out by the independent senator. And we must commend the independent senator for having the bravery to ask such a serious question to the minister on behalf of the businesses in this country. It was question 76 to the Minister of Finance, and it goes as follows. Given that $4 billion in VAT refunds or value-added tax refunds were reimbursed to businesses in fiscal 2022, can the minister provide the following? Firstly, the current value of outstanding VAT refunds to date, a timeline to clear the backlog of outstanding VAT refunds, and the mechanism outside of issuing VAT bonds being considered to avoid the reoccurrence of VAT refund backlogs. Dr. Goopeesing, the Trinidad and Tobago Chamber of Commerce is talking about it, is asking these questions. The Trinidad and Tobago Manufacturers Association are asking these questions. The independent senator appointed by the president is asking these questions. Your opposition that represents 309,000 persons who voted for us, asking these questions. So you may not want to answer the opposition, Mr. Honorable Minister of Finance, but there are many more on the line that want to know, that seek clarity, calling on you to come clean, and the Ministry of Finance to come clean and give us the actual facts and figures and what will be done. Of course, in response to the question, the Minister of Finance anchored his rationale on not paying on time on this non-compliance VAT gap, listing it as a cause of losses to the state, as he stated, and I quote, I'm quoting the minister now, when taxpayers do claim such refunds, it is the experience in many countries that they do experience significant delays. This is not unique to Trinidad and Tobago. These delays are not the result of the VAT design in itself as such, but stem from the inadequate legal and institutional frameworks and weak administrative capacity to identify VAT refunds fraud and to implement practical and workable preventative measures. In our case, in 2019, the International Monetary Fund's Fiscal Affairs Department undertook at the request of the government an exercise to measure the non-compliance gap VAT. Now, I spoke about this earlier when the minister seeked to throw the manufacturers under the bus by simply stating it's because of the non-compliance VAT gap, those who are not paying their VAT to the state. And in that statement, I made it clear that companies who have already paid VAT for items at our ports, for inputs in the manufacturing process, they are being penalized for engaging in export to the government. So the non-payment of these VAT refunds has nothing to do with this non-compliance gap that the Honourable Minister continues to use as an excuse. And this approach by the government is literally putting it as though Peter is paying for Paul. That's what it's like. And it is not a system based on fairness to companies who have invested their monies into this country and who have the tenacity during very difficult times to grow their businesses and grow export. In fact, it is the private sector in this country, as a result of the mismanagement of this government, that has been that one beacon of light that has held this economy together, while the government has dropped the ball in every other sector.
And they're doing so now in this sector.
And they're doing it so in the manufacturing sector. They completely decimated the energy sector, Dr. Goopeesing. And now they're going after the sector in trade, manufacturing sector. The law requires that the government honors their VAT payment back to these entities. And when the Minister Imbert, Honourable Minister Imbert, was asked a follow-up question on the non-compliance VAT gap, when the government will be effectively dealing with it, the Minister's response, and I want to quote it again, I need to be careful. "We are almost there," he says. "You may, if you have been following the news, you would have seen that notice would have been taken of the fact that we intend to be up and running by August 2023. And this is, of course, in regards to the commencement or startup of the Trinidad and Tobago Revenue Authority. And this means that companies that are being owed VAT today have no real assurance that this practice of piling up of VAT refunds to this level will be solved unless, of course, they believe what the minister states, that the Trinidad and Tobago Revenue Authority will be this sort of panacea that will cure all the tax administration issues and of course, the defaults in the system when it comes to VAT compliance. So that is what they are being holding on hope for. But I want to raise an issue that is an even bigger issue than that, Dr. Goopeesing. Because you see, when we consider the press release, there was a press release that came out in December the 2nd, 2022, from the Ministry of Finance. This was back in December 2022. This is the press release, right here. It says that the Ministry of Finance achieves a 1.08 billion fiscal surplus in 2022. And of course, the Honourable Minister of Finance boasted in his usual way of smirking that his government had achieved this surplus. So when we consider that press release, I put it to every right-thinking citizen in this country, to the business community who are depending upon a government to ensure that our economies run properly, that the correct statistics are delivered so that they can so that the private sector can make an educated decision on investment in this country. I put it that if the government had kept VAT refunds outstanding to the figure that was cited by the Honourable Minister of Finance in the Senate of $4.6 billion, which he stated was inherited by the PNM government from the previous administration, 4.6, oh, we know VAT refunds continue to roll over from year to year. But even if the minister kept it to at minimum $4.6 billion, which he claims he inherited from the previous administration, and paid back, at that time in October it might have been 7 billion. We don't know. We know in March it is 7.8 billion. Today it might be 8 billion. Back then it may have been 7 billion. We don't know the figure. But if the government had paid VAT refunds to keep it at least down to what they met when they came into office, I put it to you that the government would have been reporting a fiscal deficit for 2022. Instead, the government withheld paying VAT refunds, which climbed to 7.8 billion and climbing this year, and has deceptively allowed the Minister of Finance to declare a surplus last year of 1.08 billion.
Disingenuous.
Disingenuous. Perfect word. Yeah. And instead, this government and Minister Imbert has basically been playing bookkeeper in an effort to juggle numbers to guide the citizens into thinking that the economy has been managed properly by this government. So, as I come to a close on my presentation, I want to state one last area. As a businessman myself, I feel it necessary to make it clear to the nation the importance of VAT refunds to our local businesses across the sectors from the energy sector to the manufacturing sector. The government's decision to withhold a total of 7.8 billion in VAT refunds goes against the basics of proper economic management and is a decision that will have serious negative effects on our local manufacturers and for investment in our economy in general. So allow me to share just a few areas in which this withholding of value-added tax is going to impact the economy. Firstly, cash flow constraints. Our local manufacturers currently face severe cash flow restrictions as a result of this withholding of value-added tax. Since many of these companies have slim profit margins, the proposed postponed VAT refunds will cause a lack of working capital. Their potential for expansion will be stifled as a result of being unable to invest in raw materials, machinery upgrades, research and development, warehouse expansion, fleet expansion. This will impact their ability to expand. The second issue is going to be the increase in borrowing costs. Local firms will be obligated to look for external funding in order to fill this gap left by this postponed repayment of VAT refunds. And since they will have to rely on loans or other forms of credit to cover their operational needs, this will probably result in higher borrowing costs to these companies. The profit margins will be further reduced by the burden of increasing interest payments, which will further hurt their ability to compete in the national and international markets. Thirdly, this reduces a company's or our manufacturers' competitiveness. Imported goods, which frequently benefit from economies of scale globally and reduce manufacturing costs, compete fiercely with our local goods in this market as well as internationally. And of course, withholding VAT refunds creates an additional barrier to our manufacturers' ability to compete both on price and on quality. This can result in a decrease in market share, and in a worse scenario, depending on the current strength of the business, could lead to these businesses shutting their doors. And then, of course, another major issue is job losses. The negative effects of our manufacturers will trickle down to the workers, because when businesses are forced to cut expenditure because of their limited resources, one of the very first areas or big areas of cutting is, of course, their workforce, because this is one of the highest expenditures borne by any company. So we have the possibility of seeing more layoffs. So withholding these VAT refunds jeopardizes jobs, and we already got that report from the central bank showing that under this administration, in the past 8 years, we have lost almost 60,000 jobs under this PNM government. Couple more issues. amongst many others, a disincentive to invest for local manufacturers to invest in this country. To draw in both domestic and foreign investment, a stable and predictable business climate is very essential. The government choice to delay VAT refunds sends a very clear message of the ambiguity and inconsistency of their policy when it comes to paying back VAT refunds. Investors may be reluctant to put more money into this country when they see the government take these actions, and we are seeing it already, where many of our domestic companies are investing in the neighboring countries, Guyana, Grenada, Antigua, and internationally, rather than investing further in Trinidad. And many foreign direct investors have been staying away from Trinidad. It also diminishes the trust in government when the government does this. For any economy to flourish, there must be trust between the government and the business community. By refusing to issue VAT refunds, the government erodes the business confidence in its ability to run this economy and assist the private sector. And as a result, the government's business connections suffered, which makes it more difficult to promote this cooperation and teamwork between government and private sector, especially when it comes to major issues in the economy. And I stated that the government clearly is not supporting the TTMA's mandate to double manufacturing by 2025. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, the continued exile of foreign direct investors in this country. The non-payment of VAT refunds on time by this government is a serious red flag in the ease of doing business in this country, which everyone knows every area in the ease of doing business has been decimated and in decline. Especially when it comes to foreign exchange, for instance. We have already lost more than $7 billion in foreign direct investment in Trinidad and Tobago. More than $7 billion has left our shores, and it's not being replaced. We have seen Digicel move part of their operations to Jamaica. We have seen Ansor Metal leave our shores. We have seen Lieber Brothers shut their manufacturing plant. 1/3 of the Point Lisas industrial estate shut their doors. And this continues to happen under this PNM administration, who shows a clear lack of ability to woo and attract foreign investors in this country. And this makes it worse. Ladies and gentlemen, so that you know it is not the opposition stating this, my final part will be to read what has come out in this article today by the Express, because it was a scathing article showing the failure of this government when it comes to paying back refunds. I'm quoting the article on the Trinidad and Tobago Chamber of Commerce again. The Trinidad and Tobago Chamber continues to be concerned about the negative impact this delay has on the business community, from the small business community, from the small to large businesses across all industries and sectors, and by extension the wider economy. It stated, based on feedback from our members, the delay in issuing refunds has forced businesses to increase their capital required to operate in Trinidad and Tobago, as the financing of VAT refunds has now become a part of the investment cost associated with doing business. The business group argued that in the globally competitive environment, this reduces the attraction to invest in new projects. We note the government's approach as positive, and we respectfully request further information on the plans for payment of the balance. So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. That was the Trinidad and Tobago Chamber of Commerce. That was not the opposition. So as I close, the government's decision to withhold a total of $7.8 billion in VAT refunds is a grave mistake that will harm our regional industry severely. It will exacerbate cash flow problems with companies. It will raise companies' borrowing costs. It will lower our local companies' competitiveness. It can result in job losses, deter investment, and erode confidence in the government among business leaders. The government continues to fail to put things in place to place this economy on the right path. And we in the opposition are calling on them to stop paying lip service to transforming this economy. If this government cannot do the job of stabilizing this economy and putting it in growth, if this government cannot do the job to support manufacturers in this country, to support the private sector in this country, to support businesses in this country, if this government cannot do the job of running a country that is stable, that is safe, that is an environment that fosters growth and business in this country, where our children can feel safe in a school, then we call on the government to step aside. Stop driving your golf carts and playing your 18-hole games of golf. Step aside and allow the United National Congress to come back into government, because we have the people, we have the experts, and we have the ability under the Honorable Kamala Prasad Bissessar to once more bring Trinidad and Tobago back not only to what it was between 2010 and 2015, but back to the land of milk and honey. And I thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Damian Lyder, on that tremendous expose on the government's inability to manage the financial situation and owing close to $8 billion in tax payments. Before I take some questions from the media, I want to bring to the attention of the citizens an opinion by the Sunday Express today, this morning. Tell us more, Mr. Prime Minister. And it goes as follows. In distancing himself and his government from the police abduction of businessman Brent Thomas, as determined by evidence before the court, Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley has opened up a new can of worms. According to him, he has since discovered that on at least half a dozen occasions, similar operations have taken place. The editorial of the Sunday Express now asks, in addressing the crime symposium in Port of Spain 2 weeks ago, Barbados Prime Minister Ms. Mia Mottley called for the implementation of the CARICOM arrest warrant. Remember, Mr. Brent Thomas was arrested in Barbados. This warrant derives from the CARICOM arrest warrant treaty, which was signed by Dr. Rowley on December 4th, 2018. It establishes a framework for the law that must be passed by the parliament of each signatory country. Under this proposed law, applications for a CARICOM arrest warrant will have to be heard before a high court judge, which was not done, thereby continuing to ensure the individual's constitutional right not to be deprived of defined liberties without the due process of law. So the editorial speaks volumes of the inability of Prime Minister Rowley to do what is required since December 4, 2018, when the CARICOM arrest warrant treaty, which was signed by him, was not enacted, and the applications, which includes the applications for a CARICOM arrest warrant. Mr. Brent Thomas was arrested in Barbados, and that arrest warrant would have had to be heard before a high court judge. This was not done in this case. So I have quoted what the editorial of one of the newspapers has put forward today in relation to that Brent Thomas matter. And it speaks volumes of the inability of the Prime Minister, Honorable Dr. Keith Rowley, to be able to deal with this matter in a truthful and honest way. And it leaves a lot to be desired by what he is telling the country. and questions are being asked, and the editorial speaks volumes of what went wrong in this matter. But it is before the courts, and we will speak more about this later on. So members of the media, we are here to answer any questions you may have to ask us.
We saw a couple of questions coming in, Dr. Tim. First of all, to you, with regards to COVID, the news by the World Health Organization that COVID-19 is no longer a public health emergency. Yesterday, Minister Jackson said that the government's approach will not change because the government has already began transitioning down the approach to managing COVID. Does that give you confidence that they are going to start doing things that you mentioned?
Well, in the first instance, the government mismanaged the entire COVID situation. They called it a parallel healthcare system, where the other aspects of healthcare, they said that they were working very well with that. But in fact, the other aspect of it, beside the COVID thing, parallel to the COVID, was a major failure. Thousands of patients were not seen in clinic. They were not managed properly. A lot of patients waited long hours for surgery. A lot of patients had the cancers became worse. The diabetes and hypertension became worse, and the whole aspect of this parallel healthcare system failed miserably. So if he continues to say that this has been continuing, it speaks volumes for their gross incompetence and mismanagement, because what they had been doing had failed miserably over a period of time. And they try to confuse the population, parallel healthcare system, hybrid system. All of these things are meaningless when patients are suffering and dying. Why are they looking at what has been told based on the report, that the whole aspect of chronic non-communicable diseases, diabetes, hypertension, cancer, about 11,000 citizens die annually. Approximately 5,500 men, 5,500 women. Cancer is the leading cause of death in women. And heart disease and hypertension and diabetes is the leading cause of death in men. About 2,500 with strokes and cerebral vascular accidents and hypertension. 1,000 die from diabetes. 1,000 die from cancer. 500 men, 500 women. Cancer is the leading cause of death in women. Next, the chronic non-communicable disease. So focus on those things. Focus on the diabetes and the hypertension and the cancer, which are the causes of renal failure, strokes, heart attacks, amputations, 500 per year. Only old talk from Minister Dayal Singh for 7.5 years. He should have been moved forthwith by Prime Minister Rowley, but the whole bunch of them totally incompetent. When you look at the opposition team in Parliament, you tell me one person there who comes out as a very competent person. You have square pegs and round holes. You have an engineer as Minister of Finance, yeah? Call me, but Minister of Finance, and so on. So it is a government that has failed the people, totally incompetent. They lack the capability and the competence to govern this country. And they should get out and call an election as fast as possible. So Minister Dayal Singh continues to be a failure as far as management in the healthcare system. He has cost the lives of thousands of citizens in this country who could have been prevented from dying by his total mismanagement. He doesn't have a clue about what he is doing.
Sen Lyder, with regards to VAT refunds, Mr. Imbert has promised to pay part in cash recently and part via bonds. Do you think that this will go a long way to sort of easing the backlog of VAT refunds, or do you expect that there will still be an outstanding debt?
Well, I mean, it depends on how the bookkeeper intends to keep his books. If he wants to try to create another surplus at the end of this year, which we know will not happen. However, firstly, you're talking about $3 billion in bonds. This is, of course, almost like you're mortgaging the future. So this has to be paid at one point in time. But you put the $3 billion in bonds. We have no clue whether or not it will really be $1 or $2 billion, as he stated. Again, as I said earlier, many people have lost trust in anything coming out of this government. And so therefore, there's not much hope that we will actually see the 1 or 2 billion. But even even if a miracle took place and the minister actually did what he committed to doing, there's still, as the Trinidad and Tobago Chamber of Commerce stated, there's still going to be an excess of $2.8 billion at best case, as at the end of March, and billions more will be repaid, will pile up towards the end of the year. So it looks as though the minister is simply filling a hole while the hole continues to be dug deeper. And there's no clear indication as to a proper system that will be put in place to ensure that when people pay their VAT to the state and they have to reclaim it because they're exporting their goods, that the money will actually be there. And the TTMA and other agencies have made recommendations of separating the payment of VAT outside of the consolidated fund to keep it within a VAT fund so that it can be better managed and not muddled with in the consolidated fund to do these legacy projects that the Prime Minister and his government wants to conduct, as I told you all.
You remember, he had declared a budget of 58.3 or so for fiscal 2023. And then, yes, Friday, he went to Parliament to seek an additional 3.4 billion, which makes it the largest budget ever in the history over the last 15 years, larger than what they had said that was the largest UNC budget.
They condemned us for it.
Yeah, they condemned us. In addition to that, they have brought the foreign direct reserves, the foreign reserves down from 11.5 billion to close to 6.5 billion now. Almost 5 billion have been used. US. So that's 5 billion multiplied by 7, about $35 billion. And how much have they used from the Heritage and Stabilization Fund as well? So this country has been mismanaged terribly in terms of the financial situation.
And Dr. Goopeesing, you don't have to listen to the opposition when we say that. I mean, just again above on the same newspaper where we see, and here's the headline, it says, economist Dr. Roger Hussain says he is not in agreement with the International Monetary Fund statement, which concludes that Trinidad and Tobago's economy is recovering.
That's right.
So there you have it. A local economist, a well-respected economist, has chimed in on the issue of the economy. So the answer to your question is, we have no trust that it would be held, that this perennial problem of VAT refunds that has now exceeded $8 billion, probably. We have no confidence that the government will have this under control.
It comes like mortgaging the lives of your children and grandchildren.
Well, with the $3 billion bonds.
Generations.
Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay. Those are all the questions we have.
Yes.
Thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you and members of the media, thank you very much for your audience and for listening to us and viewing our Sunday press conference here at the Leader of the Opposition's office today, the 7th of May. Thank you very much.